It's been a while since I've done a video about a manga that I've liked or at least thought was interesting enough to talk about. Well, it's been a while since I've made a video, but don't worry about that. That's not the issue at hand. Anyway, during the last season of anime, I was looking through the upcoming shows to see if anything good was coming out, and I stumbled upon this anime that didn't catch me at first until I read the description and watched the trailer. Turns out what seemed like a nice countryside slice of life anime with probably top tier tan girls was actually a horror where you can't trust anyone, especially yourself. And if you've been subscribed to the channel for a while, you know I love me some horror manga. So of course I checked it out and binged it in a couple of days. And you know what? It's actually really good. And now I'm here making a video to tell you about Summertime Render, the fantastic time travel anime. Well, I say anime because I'm just kind of assuming they're not changing anything from the manga, so yeah, hopefully I can keep that title. Oh, and before I begin, spoilers ahead because I usually just end up doing that, though I'll try and keep it light. Alright, let's get into it. So what's this bad boy even about? There's the nice scenery, I said there's time travel and horror involved, so I would be surprised if you could piece it together. But let's look at the end of chart description. A tragic incident calls a young man named Shinpei back to his hometown on the remote island of Hikotoshima, Japan, but something sinister awaits upon his return and a chilling sequence of events unfolds that will have dire consequences for Shinpei, for Japan, and for the entire world. Wow, that's a lot more high stakes than I remember reading. I was going to also look at Mao synopsis, but man, they put a lot there, so I'll just fill in the blanks. For, you see, the aforementioned tragedy was that Shinpei's childhood friend Ushio tragically drowned, in a very tragic way. The people of the island just kind of accepted as her not being able to breathe while saving the little girl, but that doesn't really make much sense because A, she's extremely athletic and a really good swimmer, which everyone knew, and a big fat B, she has bruise marks around her neck, which you could maybe explain away as a little girl holding Ushio by the neck while being saved, but that makes no sense. Short of like a couple of people, no one even bats an eye. This, in theory, also makes no sense, but as the manga goes on, it starts to become clear what's going on. Our protagonist Shinpei also had the same reservations as me because he's not an idiot and starts to investigate. He talks about it to the, and I'm using air quotes here, right people, and learns about the myth of the shadow people. See, on this island there are rumors that there are shadows, or clones really, of people, and if you see your shadow, it's a wrap for you. And what do you know? Ushio saw her shadow too. Shinpei investigates this more and, spoiler alert, another one, gets himself and some others killed by the shadow of his childhood friend's little sister. Quite shocking, right? They set this up beautifully throughout the first chapter with the slowly rising tension that something isn't quite right with the island. There are multiple times where a panel will focus on someone and they're just looking, watching for no apparent reason. Couple that with the strange things occurring like a whole family disappearing, and it comes to a fever pitch when Shinpei himself says that going to the shrine later was a bad idea. From there until he gets got, I was on the edge of my seat wondering what was about to happen. And granted, it wasn't a long wait, but still. With all that said, I did mention that this is a time travel manga, right? After he dies, he goes back to when he first gets to the island, and that's when the real story gets started. Shinpei, really from his own death and the revelation that the shadows are real, immediately goes into detective mode to try and figure out what's going on. But what's a good mystery without good characters, so let's look at that first. One thing I absolutely love about Summertime Render is how there isn't the time travel trope of characters refusing to believe that they're looping into a couple loops in. It can be funny when done well, but that's not the type of story this is. Shinpei plays no games and accepts that supernatural stuff is going on almost immediately, and he's smart about it too. He doesn't go around blabbing about it because he doesn't know who's a shadow yet, so he tries not to expose himself. And this is actually huge because it does come up later where it takes a while for the main villain to figure out that he's time looping. Slight tangent, but I do want to talk about the villain for a second. I won't spoil who it is because, to be completely honest, it's a lot to explain. But the origin and creator of the shadows is a terrifying and powerful being, and he uses that to his advantage completely. There was never a moment where I felt like the villain was acting out of character, if that makes any sense. It never jobbed, and the way it ended up being beaten in the end doesn't feel like a cop-out. In fact, some of my favorite moments in this manga were times when the villain outsmarted the main characters. It created this bleak and hopeless feeling in the setting, and there are times where all really does feel lost. The villain is just as smart as the main character, and it creates a compelling struggle where I always wanted to see what both of them would come up with, especially when the villain gives Shinpei a shadow hand, which I won't spoil, but I kinda did. Whatever. Back to the main characters, to put it simply, they're all super likable, and I found myself rooting for all of them to make it to the end, even the reformed Shadow. maybe especially the Reformed Shadow. None of the characters are flawless, but they do what they can. Even Shinpei and Hizuru, who seem like massive geniuses, have their own flaws that they have to work past. The manga isn't too long, but I like that each of the good guys, except the cop, I think, got a chance to have their character explored, and as a result, we got to see how the events of the manga changed them. There was never a point where I felt like one of them were being left out or anything like that. The mangaka seemed to make it a point to try and involve the different characters whenever they could. They all have great chemistry with each other, and it makes for some genuinely funny moments. Also, I do want to point out that just like how Shinpei accepted that he was time traveling, the others accepted that he was time traveling just as easily, mostly because he had really good evidence that he was looping. Okay, so before I talk about the overall horror of the manga, I'm going to quickly talk about the aspect of Summertime Render that I feel truly sets it apart from other manga, at least for me. And that's the nature of the time looping itself, and major spoilers for this if you want to skip ahead. In this manga, there's a set point where all is lost. The villain wins and the world as we know it is essentially done for. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The main characters find out about this pretty early, so it's not a surprise to them either. They know that they're working on a time limit. Of course, they always have the time loop to lean back on, except they don't. It turns out that every time Shinpei dies in loops, he resets a little further forward in time. This means that he can only die in loop a certain amount of times until it's all over. And the worst part is that not only does he know this, but the villain figures this out as well. This creates an interesting dynamic where he still has to figure things out, but he can't be too slow about it. Of course, he can't figure out everything in one go because there are a lot of moving parts, so it's more about him gathering as much information to take into the next loop so that he can investigate other avenues he might not have thought of. It reminds me of 13 Sentinels, where certain branches are locked until you get certain keywords. This makes each loop purposeful and allows us and Shinpei to have a line to follow through the loops. I love this because it gets rid of the lollygagging that is usually seen in these Groundhog Day scenarios and gives a reason for the villain to actively hunt Shinpei. Well, not completely, because they also have to cover their tracks well enough so that Shinpei doesn't get info. Like I said, it's an internal struggle and it makes for a compelling read. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get into the horror. In my opinion, it's kind of hard to have a good scare in manga as only one of your senses are being engaged as opposed to other media. But with that said, there are a lot of good horror manga that are effective at creating tension, especially with the use of good paneling, and Summertime Render is no exception. The nature of the shadows already creates an atmosphere of unease and distrust. There's something off about the people you recognize acting unlike a human and doing some crazy shit. And that's before the shadows start becoming more akin to actual monsters. You never know who's secretly a shadow, so paranoia is a common feeling while reading. In addition to that, there's a never-ending dread of the bad things to come. Because if I'm being straight up, things rarely go well for Shinpei and the gang. It's just a matter of figuring out what's going to go wrong this time. And the violence, at least in the first half or so, is brutal and sudden. 1 second things are going well and then boom, next page someone is flying out of the window, and yeah, I probably can't show that. This is the closest thing you get to shock horror or a jump scare, and it's pretty effective. Not like I jumped or anything, but it got a little shock out of me when it happened. But while we're talking about the violence, let's talk about the action. I've been talking about the horror a lot, but would you believe me if I said that this turns into more of an action horror manga near the end? And I kinda wanna drop the horror part of that. The way I saw it, there was a sliding scale with horror on one side and action on the other. And as the manga goes on, it slowly moves from the horror side to the action side. This mostly happens because Shinpei and the others become more equipped to actually fight the shadows. It's like in a horror game where you get a gun or something and suddenly the monsters aren't so scary anymore. And it's not a bad thing, don't get me wrong. The smart writing is still there and the enemy is still overwhelmingly powerful. It ends up being fun seeing what kind of 1000 IQ level strat Shinpei comes up with, and some of the things they come up with are legitimately impressive. And the main thing that carries the transition well is the art and writing. I talked about the writing a lot, but again, it really shines in this. The manga is complicated and a lot of times I felt lost and confused because I wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but it kept me in the loop, pun intended, and explained stuff well enough for me to keep up, all while maintaining the ever-present air of mystery and therefore horror, which is hard to do. There are a lot of times where things will happen or come up and it'll be seemingly dropped, but way later it's brought back in usually big ways. The manga respects the reader and expects you to be engaged, which I love. The art is also really good, I should point that out. The characters have nice designs, everything looks great, and the setting is beautiful. I believe the island is based off the island that the mangaka actually came from, so you know, that makes sense. Also, with the action and horror, it flows nicely and is easy to follow, which is always a big plus. It never fails to get me hyped. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. Summertime Render is a fantastic work and I highly recommend reading or watching it. As of writing this video, only is out, but it looks great. I have no worries about the anime adaptation and it looks to be faithful. It's 25 episodes, so I'm pretty sure it'll cover the whole manga, but we'll see. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a like, and if you want to see more from us, definitely subscribe because I'm back on my bullshit and it's time to be consistent again. I also want to do some more anime and manga recommendations, so let me know in the comments some stuff you want to see videos on. Oh, and thanks for the 5,000 subscribers, it really means a lot. But before you go back to the past like Samurai Jack, have a good day.